Hi, everyone. So this presentation is meant to give you a good overview of India's classical age and how we would go about describing its developments. So just as we did with China, and when we went back to the Warring States period to establish the Qin rise to power, it's important here too in India to provide some historical context. So what we have to do is go back to the Vedic age, which of course is named for the Hindu text, the Vedas. And we call to memory these regional kingdoms that existed on the Indo-Gangetic plain, and that it was in this period and throughout this period that the Brahmin are very dominant. But it's also, keep in mind, in this period that Siddhartha Gautama lives. And it's Buddhism that, although it doesn't spread widely, that really does develop in this period as an early, very local challenge to Hinduism. So what is it that changes? The catalyst in India for these changes that will take place in the classical age really is the work of Alexander the Great. Although we haven't discussed as a class Alexander's rise to power, if you remember from our discussion of the Persian Empire, it was Alexander who brought down the Persian Empire. The Persians were, of course, the Achaemenid Persians were the first early empires of this period. So after the Persian Empire fell, Alexander continued his move across Asia and went down through the Hindu Kush Mountains and for a time challenged the power of the local Indian kings. Although his presence in India was short-lived, it really did shake up the existing political structures of the late Vedic age and then brought about those changes that we would see in the years to come. As one example of Alexander's legacy in India, I love looking at the evidence. We know that he absolutely did challenge the political power, but one of the things we'll be talking about in the weeks to come, after vacation in particular, is the influence that Alexander had that was cultural. And so in that northern Indian plain where Buddhism was being developed and was gaining a small local following, we see evidence here of a Buddha dressed in Greek clothing. So you can see a little bit of the blending of the two cultures. But let's focus now on specifically what really was our big takeaway from class discussion and what will be really important on the assessment, and that, of course, is the development of empire, the Mauryan Empire being first. And it's important to remember that the Mauryan Empire really is organized into two phases. The first is under Chandragupta Maurya, who in the aftermath of Alexander's short-lived conquest uses his skilled army to sweep across the northern Indian plain and bring the local areas under his control. And he sets up his capital in the northeast at Pataliputra, and he implements a bureaucracy much like many of the empires across the globe at this point during the classical age. And he sends out government officials and tax collectors and builds an infrastructure to support that system. And he even sends out spies at the advice of Kautilya, who was his key advisor. In his famous work, we see some of his advice to Arthashastra, some of that we read in class. And he really is an absolute ruler in this early phase. But he does continue to use Hinduism to his advantage. He acknowledges the importance of the Brahmin priests, and he utilizes the expectations of caste to reinforce some of his rules. What really changes is two generations later on to his grandson. His grandson inherits the territories and actually extends into new territories, but it's in this drive to conquer more area that he converts to Buddhism. And in his conversion to Buddhism, the whole nature of the government really does change, the whole purpose of the government structure. And his government now is geared towards promoting the welfare of his people. The best evidence we have of this are his edicts, which were posted throughout the empire, one of which we read in class, that were really to encourage his officials to be good to his people. As you would imagine, many of the lower caste Indians were drawn to Buddhism at the promise of spiritual equality, But there definitely were far parts of the empire that either were never reached by the monasteries and those missionaries that Asuka sent out, or people who just resisted this change and felt strongly that their Vedic roots were a part of who they were. Here we see a map of Chandragupta's conquests. Of course, this is the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and you can see up in the right-hand corner the capital of Pataliputra. And here is where the heart of the Vedic age was, right along the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the Indus and the Ganges rivers. This map shows the extent of the Mauryan dynasty that was achieved by Asuka's age. And you can see how even areas not under their direct control did serve as somewhat of a tributary system. And you can see the cities that dot the Ganges River, and some along the Indus River, and some there on the rivers that run through the Deccan Plateau. You can also see, according to this map, the sites where Buddhism was encouraged by Asuka. You see the Buddhist shrines, the stupas that were built, and also the posting of Asuka's edicts. Of course, we know that once Asuka dies, there really isn't any single person who's able to fill his shoes, and slowly but surely the Mauryan Empire disintegrates. It's not until another 400 years that a centralized leadership emerges, and that, of course, is the Gupta rule. But the Guptas don't set up a system like that of Maurya or Han, as we talked about in China. They really don't feed this big bureaucracy. Instead, they err to the side of this tributary state system. They use for their 200 years of peace and prosperity, the local Hindu priests and the traditions of Hinduism, what we talked about in class as being the reset button for India, caste, Hinduism, the importance of the Brahmin priests to support their goals. And of course the goals for Gupta was about glory and trade and wealth. This was that theater state that we talked about. So on the outside it looked as if these Gupta rulers were especially powerful, when in reality to call them an empire really is even a little bit of a stretch, because they didn't exert their influence into far parts of their empire. There really was a great deal of local autonomy. But perhaps the most interesting part of this Gupta rule, and maybe because of their lack of control, it was these local areas through the rebirth of Hinduism and Hindu culture and the patronage, the support, right, of the Brahmin priests, that we see these cultural pursuits and this rediscovery of that literary tradition that goes back to the Vedic age. Let me show you an image that maybe best captures this. Earlier in the show, I shared with you a Buddha statue that was created in the aftermath of Alexander's leadership in the north. Short-lived, but nonetheless the Greek influence in the north. And here we see later on, by the time we get to the Gupta period, this Hindu goddess, right, this return to Hinduism. And not just sculpture, but we see the creation of Hindu poetry, the very famous Hindu poet Kalidasa. And of course, as I mentioned in class already, the great discoveries in math. Our numbers, we often refer to them as Arabic numerals, but are actually Hindu Arabic numerals. The base 10, the concept of 0, all stems from this era. So to bring it to a close and to provide some summary, here's a timeline that looks at the major periods of India's classical age. So we see in the late Vedic period, ever before Alexander pushes his way in through the northern region, that we had regional kingdoms where the Brahmin priests and Hinduism was dominant, those Jana Rajyapadas. We know that there was a short period of time, what we call this Greek interlude, where Alexander comes into the north. And what's really important is not Alexander's rule here, but the political upheaval that he causes. And so in the aftermath of Alexander, we have the first empire. Chandragupta Maurya making his way in, setting up an autocracy, which is total control. conquering those northern territories, followed then two generations later by his grandson Asuka, who now has most of the subcontinent under his control, but now really challenges the cultural traditions of India by looking to spread Buddhism throughout the subcontinent, into Tibet, into Southeast Asia. By renouncing war, he redirects the focus of his empire and really brings about a new period in India. This period, of course, would then go through this slow disintegration after his death. And so before we get to that Gupta age, we have 400 years where Hinduism is reasserting itself. And so by the time we get to these Gupta rulers in this golden age, we have a loose political control, what we call a tribute system, where there's creativity absolutely encouraged, but a lack of true political cohesion. You could probably guess that when the Gupta rulers fall apart, not unlike what happened in China and what would happen in Rome, as the Huns come down by 550 through the mountain ranges, the Gupta system just completely falls apart, and India once again, right, default system goes back to those regional kingdoms that where the culture provides unity, but there is no actual singular political ruler.